At the time I'm making this video, I had just recently watched a video put out on archaeologist Flint Dibble's YouTube channel, and he did a collaboration with Milo Rossi from Mini Minuteman, also here on YouTube. And one of the points that they made was that science and educational communicators, even if you don't have that big of an audience, need to make videos, put it out there, and do as much as you possibly can to counteract all of the pseudoscience and quackery that's out there, and now has a platform because of social media such as YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all of the plethora of social media platforms that are out there. And I actually had commented in that live stream that this also has to happen with historical communicators as well. And for those of you who are new to the channel, I'm a law professor and a historian, and my area of scholarly research is in antebellum slave laws and slave codes. I have published law review articles on the antebellum slave laws of many states, slaveholding states in the antebellum South, to expose how horrific the legal system actually was, and to show you how that legal system evolved and developed into the systemic racism that we still see within the legal system today, that went from the postbellum period through Reconstruction, through the Civil Rights era, and still impacts us today. And one of the things that happens in the history world is you also have revisionist historians, people who go out there and try and twist the narrative, twist the script, and you see that a lot with the Civil War and with slavery, which is why I believe my work to be so important. You see that with the lost cause narrative, the states' rights argument for the Civil War, everything like that. So it's not just within the realm of science communicators that there is a need for people to get out there and actually post videos on YouTube to counteract the pseudoscience, but also in the world of history, in the historical realm, to make sure that we can stop revisionist historians and people who do have a large platform from completely changing the narrative of what we know to be historical truth and America's original sin, which is slavery. And that we never let that go, and we actually bring it back to the forefront, and we study it the way it needs to be studied in today's day and age. And to that point, I wanted to thank the two of them because they did inspire me to continue making videos. That also brought me, as soon as I finished watching that, I then saw that President Trump had come out, and he announced that they were going to be changing the names of military bases back to, Confederate names, and one being a base named after General Robert E. Lee, the Confederate Commander-in-Chief. And right after that video, Matt Walsh, a very conservative commentator here on YouTube, made a video saying that General Lee was a noble and respected figure. Of course, he didn't fight for slavery, he fought for his state and states' rights, and this is exactly what I was talking about. So today, I want to just slowly go through, and again, I don't focus on the Civil War and the history of the Civil War. As a law professor, I've chosen my scholarly research to be strictly to the law of antebellum slave code, slave laws. But when you study that, you do, of course, delve into the whole world of the Civil War. And I really want to expose Robert E. Lee for who he was. And all of the viewers of this channel, of course, will know that this won't be a surprise to anyone. But a lot of people, and I am in Louisiana, where we had, Lee Circle in New Orleans, where we had Lee High here in Baton Rouge, where you do see this worship of Confederate generals, and frankly, it needs to stop. Because these people were not good people. And I argue that Robert E. Lee was, in fact, a monster. And that's what I want to discuss today on a few different things. His treatment of the enslaved, his desire to secede and fight for Virginia, and secession in and of itself. So let's just look real quickly at Robert E. Lee, and let me explain to you why I believe, in truth, he is, in fact, a monster. So some of the things that Walsh got wrong is that General Lee did in fact own slaves before he inherited slaves, but he inherited slaves from his father-in-law. His father-in-law was George Washington Parke Custis, and he passed away in 1857. When he passed away, Robert E. Lee inherited somewhere around 200 enslaved people. But in the will of his father-in-law, these 200 enslaved people were to be emancipated within 5 years. That was one of the caveats within the will. And of course, Walsh looks at this and harps on this to say, see, Lee didn't want slaves, he inherited slaves, and he did free them at the end of those 5 years. Well, fine, but let's actually look at what happened in history, right? So as the executor of his father-in-law's estate, Lee took control of Arlington. It was actually his father-in-law. So when you think of Arlington as the Lee family home, he inherited from his father-in-law. That included all of the slaves, but the estate was in debt. His father-in-law had a lot of debt. So Lee's goal was to keep these enslaved people enslaved not only for 5 years, but he actually wanted to enslave them for longer than that to pay off the plantation's debts. And as a slave driver, as an enslaver, Lee was a brutal enslaver. And we're going to talk about what he did to some of these slaves in a minute. But it needs to be pointed out that Lee did not want to free these enslaved people after 5 years. Lee twice petitioned the Virginia courts asking to postpone the emancipation. And the courts shot it down. The courts disagreed with Lee, said, no, you have to follow the letter of this will, and they must be emancipated in 5 years. So, one, you could see that Lee had no intention of freeing them anytime soon. And two, he petitioned, he went through the legal system to try and get their enslavement period extended past his father-in-law's wishes. Well, what do you think that did for him mentally and emotionally when the court shot him down? Now he had these debts to pay off. He had enslaved people with a clock ticking. How do you think he treated them? Odds are is anyone could probably guess he treated them worse and drove them even harder to be able to pay off these debts. And that is exactly what happened, because the next year, in 1857, several enslaved people decided to just stop refusing to obey Lee's authority and Lee's orders. And you can't blame them. Remember, they had been told, but forget not even blaming them because they're enslaved, right? That the whole system is abhorrent and is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the history of the world, is the American system of African slavery. But just the fact that they had been promised by their former owner, which is horrible to say, that they would be freed within 5 years, or they would be freed upon his death, they simply were getting angry. They were like, this isn't what we were told. This isn't what was promised to us. So they refused to obey. Lee had them jailed, and he had them sent to a slave trader, which is, of course, now you're going to split up families, you're going to sell them, and you've heard the expression to be sold down the river. That was an expression during the slave trading time where you would usually, if you were a slave that refused to obey, if you were a slave that refused to submit, you were usually sent to more southerly plantations, especially in areas like Mississippi and Louisiana, that were known to be harsher on you and as a punishment for your disobedience. So he actually had them sent to a slave trader, and he instructed the slave trader to sell them to a good and responsible enslaver who will work them until the end of the 5-year period. So at this point, he was just punishing them and trying to find someone who would, in essence, work them to death for the remainder of the 5 years. That was his direction to the slave trader for what to do with these slaves who refused to obey his orders. But it gets even worse. And this story is what really bothers me the most. In 1859, 3 of the enslaved people that Lee inherited escaped. They escaped north, but they were captured near Pennsylvania. After they were captured, Lee ordered one of the most severe punishments you could possibly imagine. For the men, he ordered 50 lashes with a whip. For the woman, he ordered 20 lashes. But here's what you have to understand. We hear whipping, and we become so socially desensitized to it because we talk about slavery and all of this, but we don't realize how horrible it actually was, how terrible a whipping actually was, that this, more often than not, could kill you, especially if administered that many lashes. But to show you how insane this punishment actually was, Lee's overseer refused to do it. He thought it was too severe, that he refused to do these lashings, to do these whippings to these 3 enslaved individuals. And this story comes from Wesley Norris, one of the men who escaped after the Civil War. He's recounting the story of what Lee did to him. And when asked why they ran away, it's the same reason I gave you before for the enslaved who refused to comply with Lee's orders. They were told we were going to be free, and here we are still being forced to work. So you can't blame them. Just the sheer humanity of what they were told and what they were going through, they ran away. But the punishment was so severe. As I said, Lee's overseer refused to do it. But Lee didn't give up. Lee hired the local constable and paid him money to administer these lashings, to administer this whipping. And his direct orders to the constable was to lay it on well. And then, when the whipping was done, to have their backs washed with brine, with salt water. Lee was a monster. Lee was a horrible and terrible person. And this is an example of it. And you cannot say that Lee was a victim of his time, or he was a person of his time, where this is just acceptable and was understood. Because as you know, there were plenty of abolitionists since the beginning of the United States who, yes, while many of them were insanely racist as well, at least looked at the institution of African slavery in the United States and said that this is abhorrent, this is not humane. You can go back and look at the Somerset decision in Great Britain before American independence, where they said that slavery is so inhumane, it goes against any system of humanity. That's why there had to be positive law for there to be slavery. It is so odious to the laws of nature that it can't exist without positive law. So abolitionists and people who, yes, to all the detractors out there, were probably just as racist as enslavers, and you see that a lot, especially in the North, right? There were plenty of racist people, but they still understood that the system of slavery was unnatural, was abhorrent, and was odious, and all of this. So Lee to order these three to be whipped with such severity that his overseer refused to even do the punishment is insane. And then to have it washed with brine, and to have other slaves who fled, to have them sold and direct the slave trader to have them sold to someone who will work them for the remainder of the 5 years, right? He could have just sold them to anyone without any explicit direction. Or the fact that he petitioned the courts twice to have that 5-year manumission requirement absolved from his father's will so he could have them enslaved even longer. So this is just looking at how Lee dealt with slaves. And the really scary thing about this, or the horrible thing about this, is this account, I said, from Wesley Norris came after the Civil War. General Lee did not die in 1865. He went on to become president of Washington University, which is now Washington and Lee University, and he's actually buried there. This was published in multiple newspapers. Do you know who never refuted this? General Lee. Robert E. Lee. He never said this didn't happen. He had plenty of opportunity to. He knew it existed. He was well aware that this was printed in newspapers. So Lee's biographers and Lee historians have tried to prove the story false. But the one person who had opportunity to say this never happened never actually came out and said it didn't happen. Why? Because it did. So to claim that Robert E. Lee is a noble and benevolent person is simply false. And in this video is already 12 minutes. I don't want it to go too long. But in the following video, I'll explain to you why he wasn't fighting for the nobility of states' rights or Virginia or any of this other nonsense. We know clearly that the reason the South seceded from the Union was to preserve and protect the institution of slavery. And you know from the account that I've just given you, multiple accounts of what Lee did with his slaves, that Lee was a proponent and an advocate of the system of slavery, and that if Virginia was going to leave to protect and defend that institution. In fact, you talk about like Lee having to go and defend his state of Virginia. There were 9. Lee was a colonel in the U.S. Army at the time of secession, a full bird colonel, to distinguish from lieutenant colonel, the rank right below brigadier general. There were 9 full bird colonels in Virginia at the start of the Civil War. Lee was one of them. 8 sided with the Union. Lee was the only one who decided to defect and go to the South and fight for Virginia. Lee's cousins, Lee's family members, stayed loyal to the Union. Fitzgerald Lee remained in service to the Union as a JAG officer. He was an attorney in the U.S. Army. Samuel Phillips Lee was in the Navy. He also stayed loyal. Robert E. Lee's cousin, Robert Jones, stayed loyal to the Union. Another cousin, John Upster, stayed loyal to the Union. So this idea that he couldn't fight against his family is also undermined because many of his family went to fight for the Union, and he decided to fight against the Union. I've heard many people argue it would have been one thing if he decided not to fight at all, because I can't fight my brother, my family, and I can't fight against my state, resign his commission, and decide not to fight for anyone. That at least would have maybe had an inkling of nobility right there. But this argument that he had to fight for Virginia because he couldn't raise a sword against the state or against his family simply isn't true. A lot of his family, the majority of his family, fought for the Union. And all of the colonels, except for him, who were from the state of Virginia, decided to stay with the Union. Why? Because they understood that the issue of slavery, or any issue of states within states or between states, needed to be dealt with through the proper legal channels, and that secession would cause exactly what it caused: war, anarchy, death, and destruction. And also, this argument of the states' rights, of course, has been beaten to death, so I won't beat it to death here on this channel, but we know unequivocally, without question, the right the states were trying to protect was the institution of African slavery. South Carolina said it clearly in their secession ordinance, citing that an increase in hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery was the reason they were seceding from the Union. Georgia said, for the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave-holding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. They even noted that subordination and the political and social inequality of the African race was fully conceded by all at the time of the Constitution being drafted. Mississippi said, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. And Texas declared they are leaving the Union because of the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. So to say Lee was a great man, to say Lee was a noble Southerner, is nonsense. And that is revisionist history. General Lee, Robert E. Lee, he was never a general, he was a Confederate general. You can call him colonel if you want. That's half the reason why he only wore colonel ranks on his Confederate uniform. He was not a good person. He was an enslaver, he was a monster. He was fighting for the cause of the enslavement of a race of people, that being anyone of African descent, and for the continued, to continue that institution in perpetuity. That was the only reason Lee fought for the Confederacy, and to become, in his own egotistical way, the George Washington of the Confederate States. That's what many people believe he attempted to do, and that's what he wanted to do, and I can go on at length about that, but again, I just wanted to make this quick video to show you. I can give you one example when we talk about, Matt Walsh tried to say, well, he inherited his slaves. He wasn't really an enslaver. No, he was a terrible enslaver. And he was terrible to these human beings that he enslaved, including torturing them when they ran away expecting to have been freed in accordance with his father-in-law's will. So again, remember, I agree with Milo Rossi, Mini Minuteman, and Professor Dibble, that not just in the realm of science, but in the realm of history, that if you have a platform, you need to come out and make videos as much as possible to try and educate people and to try and stop as best we can revisionist history here on social media, and especially here on YouTube as well. So thank you for watching. Please remember to like, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next video.